Okay, Beit Hanan. So that's the parashah this week. It's the second parashah in the book of Deuteronomy. I've called it Jewish evangelism, and I've talked about this before. It's essentially I've done a study on um, sort of I guess not the main sort of ideas and themes regarding evangelism in the Bible. But what I've done this time around is I've sort of added some examples and a bit of discussion from history as well. So I think it'll contextualize the teaching much better than when I first gave it. It's quite a long portion in scriptures. It's a few chapters in Deuteronomy and also the prophet's portion in Isaiah and the book of Luke, chapter 3. We'll move on. I wanted to just quickly summarize the parasha for this week, though. We've got Moses continuing his speech. So most of Deuteronomy is also not really narrative. It's sort of a rehashing by Moses of what's happened, but also the I guess the main teaching. So it's called Deuteronomy from the Greek words deuteros nomos, the second law. So it's that refers to the rehashing or the sort of retelling of the pertinent aspects of the Torah. So we actually read the Ten Commandments and the Shema, which were both given elsewhere, but just rehashing those this week. There's a very prominent theme for the importance of Israel to obey God and keep the Torah. Having said this, Moses does predict that Israel will sin and turn away from God as well. And we also read about how Israel was meant to be an example to the nations. And that's where I'll focus on a little bit today as a springboard for the rest of the discussion. So we'll just read carefully Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. It says, "Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' What other nation is so great as to have their gods near to them the way the Lord our God is near to us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" So it's quite clear from here that not only was Israel meant to sort of obey God for the sake of obeying God and for his covenant, but also to be an example to the world of how God wants us to live. And by keeping the Torah, Israel was actually supposed to be a great testimony to the nations, to be able to sort of show how not only how great that they were, but also how great and wonderful and wise and noble our God was by being a living example of his laws. Unfortunately, throughout history, we know that this didn't happen very often. Most of the time, Israel was more in sin than not, but this was the original ideal. Now, very interestingly, even though it talks about Israel being an example to the nations, there's no Jewish Great Commission. There's no commandment per se to try and gather converts. There's no commandments to directly evangelize. But there was an understanding that the nation, which would be the nation of God, the nation that followed God, which was Israel, would lead by example and perhaps bring people to God as well. There are themes, especially referring to the Messianic era, where the nations would look to the God of Israel as well, and we believe, of course, that's fulfilled through the example of Yeshua, our Messiah. Next slide, please. Awesome. So, I mean, I've put this provocative title there, Jewish versus Christian evangelism. It seems like a bit of an oxymoron because, Jews are not really known to evangelize, especially today. But I don't think that was the case all the time. We definitely, there's evidence in the New Testament that the Jewish leadership did evangelize somewhat. I'm not really sure what that looked like, but they did look for converts in ancient times. And obviously we have modern Christianity, with obviously its many great traditions of mission, of missionaries, and there are many great missionaries who are responsible for bringing Christianity to different parts of the world. And there's so many of us today, I'm sure, watching wouldn't be Christians without the work of these missionaries. Now, it's interesting, though, to note that Israel was meant to be an example to the nations without sort of a direct evangelistic focus. There wasn't like this, like I mentioned, the commandments to go out and evangelize, to go on missions. And of course, it's sort of contrasting to I guess how Christianity has been in the last several centuries in terms of spending great money, time, and energy. In fact, many people spend their whole lives going out and being missionaries. So it's interesting that the approach that God gave the Jewish people was quite different to this. He gave them basically, he wanted them to live their lives according to His law, and be the light of their example, be the light. And obviously, the Great Commission can be interpreted as that as well, but also to Christianity is interpreted as literally go out and share to the four corners of the earth and preach the gospel as well, which I think is correct. But there's also evidence in the New Testament that the first believers thought similarly to the Jewish people as well, that there was a huge aspect of the example of the witness being the most important thing. So I'll use just a couple of examples from the New Testament. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 5, Paul told the Colossians to walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time, in reference to, of course, there's the anticipation that the end is near, and walking wisdom towards outsiders is to sort of conduct yourselves in a wise and noble way to, I guess, give a good impression of what the God that you believe in. And Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, Peter said to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. And that speaks directly to the example that Israel was supposed to be. So, even though they may not like the God of Israel, believe the God of Israel, they can see the good works of His followers and therefore glorify the deeds of God. So that's something that also Yeshua mentions directly in the Gospels as well. But it's throughout the New Testament really that we really see that same focus on leading by example. The apostles would have learned this from Yeshua himself, of course, and the best, the clearest example that I can see from the Gospels is from chapter 5 in the book of Matthew, and Yeshua says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." So again, Yeshua saying really directly, almost verbatim, what our parashah is saying is that let the nations, let the people who don't believe in our God see your good works, and even so, they may glorify, because of your works, they may glorify God. And the above concepts which Yeshua is teaching is probably from our parashah, but also is echoed through the prophets as well. And from Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3, we read, "And nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." And that's referring to sort of the spirit, the godliness that will be in Israel, not necessarily to the physical light. It's more of it's a metaphorical aspect for the righteousness and the spirit that it would be among the people. And that the term light to the nations or light of the nations, that comes from this sort of idea. Now, what does this teach us? So I think it teaches us a couple of things. I think it sort of shatters or at least challenges a few paradigms that both Jews and Christians have had. So it shows that the conventional Jewish wisdom today of sort of not evangelizing at all is probably not according to the Torah, as in actually I think part of Torah observance, I mean from a Jewish perspective anyway, part of Torah observance is actually to expect some level of evangelism, at least by example. There is an idea that God expected the people of Israel to be an example to the nations, and that does count as evangelism. It was not only for the sake of keeping the covenant; it was also for the sake of being an example to the world. So I think that challenges conventional Jewish wisdom today, and because you guys would know, perhaps because of the examples of history or a change in ideology, that there's very minimal evangelism in modern Judaism today. I will say, with the exception of Chabad. Chabad probably bucks the trend and is fairly evangelistic, but even then, they're more sort of evangelistic towards Jewish people who are not observant, as opposed to bringing non-Jews into the faith. However, I will also like to challenge perhaps some of the conventional, Christian paradigms, in the sense that I think sometimes we're used to seeing in-your-face brash evangelism, in the sense that sort of really preaching, preaching the. I mean, look, we should preach the gospel, but really by preaching the gospel is like really, sort of in your face, in a very brash, in your face style, like very, very heavy on preaching and not much on the example. And we can see from the scriptures here that the Great Commission was, yes, you have to preach the gospel, and Yeshua did tell his disciples to go out and tell people about him, and also we see the example of the disciples. But it was also more about a witness by example. The way that people were really moved, even in the New Testament, was by the example of the believers as well as the teaching. So sometimes, witnessing by example, like at least for my journey as well, like when my Christian friend witnessed to me, the example was much more powerful than any preaching that he did. He actually didn't preach to me at all. So I can definitely speak from experience the power of the example. There's actually a Jewish, I can't remember exactly, but there's a Jewish proverb which I think actually comes from the book of Proverbs itself. It sort of goes like this. It says like sort of speak little and do much. I think it actually comes from Proverbs as well. And it's sort of just a summary of the idea. You're going to make the most impact on people by doing more, and sometimes we talk a bit too much, like I'm doing now. So I wanted to share that example with you guys. And it should be noted that even though Judaism does not evangelize directly these days, at least in sort of the last several centuries, perhaps even 2,000 years, Judaism attracts its fair share of converts. Like people still who are not born Jewish convert to Judaism, which is interesting because it's interesting that a religion who doesn't really look for converts still attracts converts. I guess maybe not in the same numbers, but it's not really a numbers game, is it? So it's interesting that this still occurs. So it shows to the power of the example of the way of living being attractive to I guess people who are not part of that teaching. Now, I wanted to. This is, I guess, a little bit different to what I did last time. I want to talk about Christianity in the Roman Empire, which I think was a terrible example of evangelism, and I think actually contributed to many of the later crimes of the church. So I want to give a bit of context to this. So I will say much of the criticism and the lack of popularity in Western Christianity today. So as we know, I think it's well known that Christianity is definitely spreading and it's increasing through traditionally non-Christian nations. For example, in Islamic countries in Central Asia, in those sort of places, Christianity and the gospel is definitely spreading. However, as we also would all know now, Christianity in the West, especially in the last 40, 50 years, has definitely been on the decline. So, of course, we've got churches closing. We've got also, not only that, institutions like sort of becoming less powerful, less prominent, but really just the general population, the general antipathy, animosity against the Western church. And much of the criticism of the Western church stems from, I guess, sort of an embarrassment or a guilt that Western people sort of feel towards the historical church in regards to the abuses that have been committed in the name of Jesus in Western Europe throughout the centuries. And I think it can be a lot of these, I guess, really, really great crimes that the church has committed. There's no doubt that the church has committed terrible crimes in the name of Jesus. I think this can be partly attributed to the way that Christianity was established in Europe. Now, I want to give a quick timeline. So basically, of course, we have the time when Yeshua ascended to heaven, and his disciples were spreading the word throughout Judea and Samaria and throughout the Middle East. And also we know that throughout the New Testament, Paul, in his great sort of missionary trips, he brings the gospel to what today is Turkey, so Asia Minor, and also into Europe, into Greece, into Macedonia, into Rome as well. So, and we know throughout the first sort of 300, 250, 300 odd years of its existence, Christianity was very underground, was very grassroots, and it spread like wildfire, even though it was heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire. But that changed very quickly. So by the time of Emperor Constantine, things were changing. So Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Now, the circumstances of the conversion are subject to debate, There are some people who say, he claimed that he had a dream and that he saw a vision, and that convinced him to change. Some people thought it was completely political. It was a political choice because he saw how popular Christianity was throughout the empire. Whatever the reason was, his conversion made probably the biggest impact on Christianity of any political shift throughout its history, because all of a sudden Christianity became the sort of outcast of the empire to becoming the legitimate and the only accepted faith of the empire. So I'll go through the timeline. So in 313 of the Common Era, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. So the Edict of Milan basically gave Christianity legitimacy. It became a permitted religion within the empire, where previously it wasn't officially allowed to be practiced. Like in the Roman Empire, the Romans had their own religion, and they were not as intolerant to other religions as it's made out to be. The reason they crushed the Jewish rebellions was not because of an intolerance to Judaism per se. It was because the Jews were trying to fight for their independence. And of course, when there was any political attack, the Romans were very, very brutal. But it wasn't because of Judaism per se. The Romans actually allowed a lot of the surrounding nations to practice their faith, but they also had to practice the Roman faith. So that was the compromise. So they expected, because in the Roman eyes, sort of praying to their gods and sacrificing to their gods was a political statement as well as a religious statement. Now, the Jews had a way of getting around this, and they sort of found ways to have legal protections in the empire while also sort of not sacrificing to the Roman gods. Christianity, even though it came from Judaism, was seen as a different religion, and they didn't have the same protections, which is partly why when they refused to worship the Roman gods as well, they were heavily persecuted. Now, this changed with Constantine. Christianity became legitimate in its own right, and they didn't have to obey the Roman gods as well. And of course, we know the Council of Nicaea in 325 was probably the most significant Christian conference in history, where basically the sort of orthodox tenets of Christian faith were established. I don't mean orthodox in the sense of the Orthodox Church of today. I mean like what's generally considered as non-heretical Christianity. The sort of main theological points were settled at this treaty, though subject to debate, of course, for many centuries after. And 380 was probably the biggest decision. It was the Edict of Thessalonica, where Nicene Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So that's huge, because it did a few things. Firstly, it essentially outlawed all other expressions of Christianity, and there were a few at the time. At least it outlawed them in the Roman Empire. And number two, it essentially made Roman citizens Christians. Not in the sense that they were born again Christians, but they officially became members of the Roman Church, because it became very difficult to exist in the empire without being a Christian. There were lots of disadvantages politically and economically for not being part of this faith. And it really cemented Christianity as having the seat of power in the empire. So in essentially a lifetime, Christianity went from being this leper, this undesired group of people, into being having the power in probably the largest empire we've ever seen until this point. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the Roman Empire itself had a huge impact on Christianity. That's very important to note. So, of course, we know that Christianity came obviously from Judaism, and it's obviously Judaic in its roots. As we speak about very much at Beit HaMashiach, the importance of the Jewish roots of Christianity, but there is no doubt that Rome had a huge impact on Christianity as well. Initially, it's kind of ironic, because initially Rome was the chief persecutor of Christianity, but once Christianity was accepted, the Roman influence actually sort of influenced Christianity to adopt many Roman aspects of ideology and tradition. I'll give you a few examples. Now, I'm not really talking about sort of the born-again Christianity that's we're used to, but I'm talking about sort of Christian history and the main denominations that have come out of this. So, for example, for any Catholics, so the title, the Pope's official title is the Pontifex Maximus. Kind of a really awesome title when you think about it. I'm the Pontifex Maximus. Yeah, really interesting title there. But essentially, the root for that title actually is from the Roman religion. So the Pontifex Maximus was the high priest in the Roman religion, and it's kind of interesting how the high priest of the Christian faith or the Western Christian faith was actually taken from the Roman religion directly. So that's exactly the same title that was used. So again, it's a direct impact of the Roman religion on Christianity, or on Catholicism anyway. And even the creation of Constantinople. So Constantinople is the city of Istanbul in Turkey today, but Constantinople was for almost 1,000 years the seat of the Byzantine Empire and the seat of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern European / Slavic / sort of Middle Asian churches. Constantinople, which was directly named after Constantine. He wanted a new city for himself, which was a Christian city. He actually made Constantinople for two reasons, we believe. Firstly, Rome was sort of losing the empire was becoming very fragmented, so he wanted two seats of power politically. So Rome for the west, a city in the east, Constantinople. But also he wanted a city, for I guess a religious reason, that he wanted a Christian city which was not tainted by previous Roman religion. So of course Rome was the seat of the Roman religion for hundreds of years. So Constantinople, in his view, would be a new Christian city. And of course, Asia Minor, which is Turkey today, more or less, was a part of the empire where Christianity was flourishing. So he thought it would be a good place to build that city there. So that's sort of the reason. But it's very interesting that Constantinople became the seat of Christian power really in the world for almost 1,000 years after Rome fell. So that's again a direct influence from the Roman Emperor himself. And of course, even the later schism between Western and Eastern Christianity, so between the Catholics, the Roman Catholics of the West and the Orthodox Christians of the East, it actually mirrored the political division between West and East of the Roman Empire. So we have to understand, but in the last few hundred years of the Roman Empire's existence, political power was very fragmented. The empire becomes so big, it could not really be held together, and it was vulnerable to attack and vulnerable to internal division and strife. So it really mirrors this political divide between the West and the East as well. So between Rome and the West and Constantinople in the East. So that's, I think, a direct influence. The schism that later developed was actually directly influenced by the politics of the later Roman Empire. So, if we dig below the surface, we can actually see that the Roman Empire had a huge impact on early Christianity, more than we like to think. We'll move on to the next slide. And once Christianity became the official religion, this has to be emphasized, it became advantageous from a worldly point of view to adopt it. So this caused lots and lots of people to adopt Christianity officially without actually believing in it. It's sort of a flip side to what happened initially. Initially, Christianity was persecuted, and people who really who wanted to be Christians, they had to really believe in it, because from a worldly point of view, it was terrible to be a Christian. You would have your property confiscated, you'd be at risk of execution, you'd be isolated politically and economically and socially. It was really a bad thing to be a Christian from a worldly perspective until this shift happened. Once this shift happened, it was the opposite. It was politically, socially, economically disadvantageous to not be a Christian. So meaning that many people in the empire became Christians, not because they really were born again and they had the Spirit in them, but only because they wanted these advantages. And that was really a terrible thing for Christianity. That's an example of the evangelism that happened here. It wasn't direct evangelism, of course, but when Christianity was made the only acceptable religion, and this happened not even with Constantine, but actually it was with a later emperor, Theodosius. Theodosius actually persecuted the pagans. So the pagans included the Roman worshippers, the original Roman worshippers, and he essentially, in practice, made Christianity the only acceptable faith. And this essentially caused Roman citizens, if they wanted to be a part of the empire, they had to accept Christianity in practice. And this was a really terrible method of evangelism, because essentially it brought people into the faith who didn't believe in it, really, and only really went into it only to escape these disadvantages. And we have, by the year 400 of the Common Era, approximately 30 million Christians in the Roman Empire. And that was about 50% of the empire. And a vast majority of them were not Christians by choice or by faith. They were Christians because of our convenience. And that had, I think, a terrible that set a terrible precedent for, I guess, Christianity throughout Western Europe after this time. Because when you think about it, like the Roman Empire, of course, fell within the next century, and Roman Catholicism took its place as having the seat of power in Europe for at least the next 14, 15 centuries. And we have this little political, you know, political foundation for the religion, whereas Christianity is not, and belief in Yeshua is not supposed to be something which is founded on politics. It's supposed to be something that's founded on the Spirit and on faith. And once we have this this foundation, the Hebraic roots, the ground roots, the organic growth of Christianity was replaced with this political system, which I think caused so much corruption. Of course, the church still did a lot of good in the world too. I'm not denying that, but I think its roots were corrupted very much by its mixing with the Roman principles. It's just, I think, unfortunate example of how probably the largest example of evangelism in history. It went very terribly wrong, and I think it actually partly explains why European Christianity made such grave mistakes and grave crimes against many people, including the Jewish people as well. So I'll end my discussion there from that point of view, but we'll move on. So I ask a rhetorical question here, just to sort of summarize what we said. I ask, would the above process of political intrigue, official privileges, and repression of the opposition lead to masses of born-again believers being incorporated into the church? So, of course, the answer is no. That's a rhetorical question. If it's not rhetorical, please talk to me afterwards, but that should be a rhetorical question to us all. In my view, the reforms, quote-unquote reforms, of the 4th century designed to advance Christianity were the most significant factors leading to the later corruption of Christianity, as I previously mentioned. I won't label the point any more than that. Now, I guess another question is evangelism bad? And of course, no one would actually argue that the Roman model is the ideal model for evangelism. But I guess the question could be asked, does this cast into doubt the morality of the Great Commission? So essentially, I guess the question is a religion that's designed to be a missionary faith, so designed to attract converts, is such a religion doomed to corruption? Is it actually possible to have a pure expression of such a faith? That's the question that I'm asking. And of course, the answer is yes. Of course, evangelism is not bad in itself. Evangelism is commanded, and evangelism, if done in the right spirit, is the tool in which the knowledge of God spreads throughout the world. But no one is, of course, advocating for the Roman model. Our witness must be primarily driven by example, by quietly carrying out our business, obeying God. Allowing others to see our example will probably have a more powerful impact on others, as opposed to just preaching, which I think many people can find fatiguing. Now, of course, preaching has a role, but I don't think it should be what we rely on exclusively to drive our witness. Now, bullying, coercion, and threats are never legitimate tools to evangelize. Now, it sounds quite obvious. Like, you might be asking me at home, why am I actually talking about this? Isn't this obvious? Well, it's obvious to us, I hope, but throughout a lot of Christian history, it wasn't obvious. Christianity evangelized many times throughout history with a really aggressive, coercive style. Like I was talking about the history of the Jewish people in Spain a few months ago, and so much of the experience of Christianity in Spain was, essentially, you convert or you die, you convert or you leave. Really, really gross abuses by the church in the name of evangelism here. So it's definitely not a rule throughout Christian history that evangelism was done right, which I think it should be. We should talk. We should really acknowledge and discuss today as well. And the promise of the Messianic era is that people would come to God. So we actually are assured that people will come to the God of Israel. And many peoples will come and say, from the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 3, come, that we may pass. Micah 4, as we sing every week in Kibbutz Zion, for the law will go forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So we are promised indeed that the knowledge of God will be taught and will spread throughout the world, and we believe this has come forth through the example of Yeshua the Messiah. Thank you. We'll end there.